before he became a philosopher, he had a diploma in biology with us in Basel at the Biozentrum, working on molecular biology. So that's a nice thing. He has broad background information on natural sciences, and of course has now also all what we need for philosophical considerations. I make a short introduction. As intelligent living organisms, humans possess a curiosity which is a driving force both for scientific research and for reflections on the encountered living conditions and their origin. This leads them to carry out theoretical and experimental scientific research and to make thought experiments. The outcome of these approaches represents important contributions to the worldview, which provides to us orientation knowledge that gives us an important basis for our life activities. Marcel Weber is now explaining what we mean with thought experiments.
Thank you. As a philosopher, I study human thought, and we would like to tell you a few things about what we believe is an important category of human thought that is complementary to scientific experimentation and scientific observation, namely thought experiments. Thought experiments are fictive scenarios imagined in order to explore the implications of a scientific theory or of a philosophical account. Philosophers widely use thought experiments in order to check whether some philosophical account accords with widely held intuitions, for example, intuitions about the moral acceptability of actions. By contrast, scientists use thought experiments in order to check whether their theories are internally consistent or whether they agree with everyday experience. But there are other uses of thought experiments, as we shall see. An example of a thought experiment that checks whether a scientific theory is consistent with everyday experience can be found in Galileo's dialogues. For example, when Galileo shows that falling objects can still appear as if they were moving in a straight line perpendicular to the surface of the Earth, even if the Earth moves. Galileo shows this by asking his interlocutors to imagine that they were standing on a moving ship and watch a rock fall along the ship's mast. In a similar way, the more recent physicist, James Clerk Maxwell, imagined a microscopic demon who operates a shutter between two containers of a gas, letting only the fastest molecules pass. This thought experiment exposed certain limits of the second law of thermodynamics as it was understood at that time. But thought experiments cannot only be found in the history of science, there are also very recent examples. In the journal Nature Communications, for example, we can find an article published on 18th September 2018, where two contemporary physicists, Daniela Frauchiger and Renato Renner from the ETH Zurich, describe a thought experiment that is supposed to prove that quantum theory cannot consistently be applied to itself, i.e., to an agent performing a quantum measurement. But thought experiments can not only be found in physics, but also in other areas of science, for example, economics or biology. The British economist Thomas Malthus famously imagined what would happen if the human population reproduced unrestrictedly. Because this leads to geometrical, i.e. exponential growth, while the productivity can only grow arithmetically, starvation, poverty, and disease would ensue. So Malthus obviously did not yet have the data available that Professor Lutz has, so he had to rely on thought experiments. Now, this thought experiment by Malthus is known to have been an important influence on Charles Darwin's idea of natural selection. Darwin struggled to provide proof for his principle of natural selection. One line of evidence he provided in his influential book On the Origin of Species consisted in showing how much artificial selection could change an organism's heritable traits, for example, in domestic dogs or pigeons. But this was artificial selection, and what he needed to prove was the possibility of natural selection. As Darwin had no experimental data or field observation on this phenomenon available, he resorted to thought experiments, as it is shown in the following citations from The Origin of Species. I cite, "Let us take the case of a wolf, which preys on various animals, securing some by craft, some by strength, and some by fleetness. And let us suppose that the fleetest prey, a deer for instance, had from any change in the country increased in numbers, or that other prey had decreased in numbers during that season of the year when the wolf is hardest pressed for food. I can, under such circumstances, see no reason to doubt that the swiftest and slimmest wolves would have the best chance of surviving, and so be preserved or selected. Now, if any slight innate change of habit or of structure benefited an individual wolf, it would have the best chance of surviving and of leaving offspring. Some of its young would probably inherit the same habits or structure, and by the repetition of this process, a new variety might be formed, which would either supplant or coexist with the parent form of wolf." End of quote. Thus, Darwin imagined what would happen under certain conditions in nature, and this was one of his chief arguments for the occurrence of natural selection. It should also be noted that some contemporary accounts, now today of course we have hard data on the occurrence of natural selection, but it should be noted that some contemporary accounts of the origin of life are also thought experiments. An example is provided by the idea that life started out with ribonucleic acids, or RNAs, that can catalyze their own synthesis. This is known as the Rna World Hypothesis. Of course, such molecules, self-catalytic RNAs, are known to exist, but their presumed role in the origin of life is nothing but a thought experiment. I hope that these examples suffice to illustrate the point that while all scientific knowledge must be ultimately based on empirical data, imagination and thought experiments can nonetheless play a role in scientific research. They help the human mind to chart our scientific knowledge and make sure that it coheres with the rest of our knowledge, including our common everyday experience. Indeed, a considerable part of our scientific worldview is based on thought experiments and not on hard data. One could perhaps even say that there are some thought experiments that have changed the world.
I like to ask the question, can we consider creation myths as thought experiments? Reflections on the people's lives under convenient living conditions are likely to have been made by curious early farmers and their compatriots already a few thousand years ago. Various resulting creation myths took their origin at a number of locations on our planet. Often, divinity was seen to act as creator of living conditions and of living organisms. One of these accounts is included in the Genesis chapter of our Bible. Religious people interpret this as this kind of insights into our existence as divine revelations. But this does not exclude that one can count creation myths as resulting from a kind of thought experiments based on intelligence.
Creation myths also had an undeniable impact on science, as can be seen in the case we have already mentioned, namely the case of Darwin. A theologian and Anglican priest, Darwin started out as an ardent follower of the English tradition of physical theology that sought to prove the existence of God by studying the ingenious ways in which organisms appeared to be adapted to their form of life. Darwin absolutely needed to find an alternative explanation for this adaptation, which was his main motivation for elaborating a theory of natural selection. I think that these cases also use fiction in scientific reasoning and are therefore a form of thought experiment.
For saving time, I here jump on some paragraphs in our manuscript in order, well, yes, that helps me to be in time with our presentation. One of these segments is the question of is there life on other planets, in particular exoplanets, which are turning around not of our sun, but of other stars. The next section is the acquired knowledge on evolution processes. Available scientific insights lead to the conclusion that natural evolution generally proceeds extremely slowly. This renders these ongoing evolutionary processes at the levels of the universe, of our planet, and of its living populations hardly visible to us in our lifetime. This slowness ensures a relatively good stability of living populations and of their living conditions. Available knowledge from studies on biological evolution, on geology, and on astrophysics forms a basis for these conclusions. Some natural scientists see these processes providing a remarkable stability as pointing to a self-organization by nature. I come now to discuss scientific and religious views on creation processes. So far, scientific attempts to create a simple living organism ex nihilo has failed. In contrast, our available knowledge on biological evolution processes indicates that all living organisms present on our planet must have evolved stepwise in the past from one or more primitive microorganisms, bacteria. One can consider this process as continuous permanent creation by nature's self-organization. Thanks to self-organization, the Creator did not have to bring into existence each individual species, but he may have laid down principles that allow the components of the universe to become ever more diverse in the course of time. In the cultural history of mankind, individual deities were often assumed to act as creators in favor of humanity. This led to the concept of polytheism. However, more recently, a single God became seen in the concept of monotheism to act in all these events. I personally appreciate the Christian view of the Trinity, in which God is 3 in 1 and 1 in 3, that is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The Son is Jesus, the founder of the Christian religion, providing to human believers useful stimulations for their life activities. In contrast, God Father and the Holy Spirit are not living organisms, but rather conceptual entities. In this concept, the Trinity acts not only on earth, but it is the divinity for the entire universe. I like to make a few conclusions. Thought experiments can be seen as the results of human reflections that are based on available knowledge and on ideas how the studied objects might contribute to the process under study. Thought experiments were already carried out a few thousand years ago. In contrast, serious scientific investigations have a shorter history and have become intense only in the last few hundred years. At present time, solid scientific knowledge can beneficially contribute to thought experiments, and thought experiments can stimulate to carry out scientific research projects. The two approaches are complementary, and they can help to obtain deeper insight into various natural properties.